Good morning. Welcome to the first conference of the first talk, of the SEFA Conference. Our first invited speaker is Rosanna Keefe. She's professor at the University of Sheffield, and she was head of the department until very recently. She's working mainly on topics such as philosophy of logic, philosophy of language, and metaphysics, and the topic of vagueness is particularly prominent in her research studies. She's published a couple of books, a widely read reader. She did it with Peter Smith, I think, on vagueness, and then a book on theories of vagueness in Cambridge University Press. Apart from that, she's published different articles in journals such as Mind, Synthesis, Philosophical Studies. And, she's going to talk today about vague beliefs and vaguely believing. So I just give her the word.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much to all the committee for inviting me. It's a real honour to be here. My first time in Valencia, even though there are lovely tight connections between Sheffield and Valencia, and have been for some years. So delighted to be here. As Jodie said, I'm going to talk about vague beliefs and vaguely believing. I think that belief ascription is a vague matter. You can have borderline vague beliefs. I don't think that in itself is very surprising. I think that most words are vague. So in itself, that may not be surprising, but I think it's a route through to thinking about some interesting issues. So we have a complex and messy array of doxastic states. We talk about beliefs as a broad category. It's a vague broad category, but still can be important in relation to reasoning, assertion, etc. Thinking about the way in which there's vagueness within that category, I think, can illuminate various issues, including regarding reasoning, how we do and should reason under uncertainty. I think a lot of interesting, difficult cases involving belief hover around the borderline region of belief and around the fuzzy boundaries. So I think getting clear on whether and the extent and the way in which belief is vague, I think, is important in thinking about these issues. So, as I say, I think belief ascription is a vague matter. I think there are borderline cases of S believes that P. There are clear cases, of course. I believe that I'm in Spain, etc., etc. There are clear non-cases. It's clearly false that I believe I'm in France. But there are also borderline cases. So I want to say a bit about some putative borderline cases. Some might be more clearly borderline than others, or it might give you a source of things where you're more inclined to call them borderline than others. First of all, as you know, our beliefs vary in strength. They vary greatly in strength. Or our degree of confidence. When we say we believe something, we're fully aware that there might be a little bit of uncertainty. We still say we believe, but we're a little bit uncertain. Maybe if pushed, we might express the uncertainty. So I believe that Geordie's been to England at least 5 times. I believe more strongly that he's been at least twice. I believe that there'll be coffee in the break. I believe there'll be tea as well, maybe slightly less strongly. Clearly, there's a lot of variation in the strengths of our beliefs, and you might expect that if that's going to be the case, you'll end up with some in the borderline region. Do I believe there'll be fruity tea in the break? I don't know, really. Yeah, I do. Yeah, but it's kind of, I'm not sure whether I'm confident enough to say that's a belief. As we'll talk about later, whether I'm likely to say I believe it might depend on the stakes, the context, various other factors. But I think that's quite typical of borderline cases. That is a characteristic source of borderline cases. A kind of scale, maybe a rough scale. I'll talk a bit later about credences, the relation to that scale. But some think it's very natural to think that there's a vague kind of threshold of degree of confidence required for belief. So that's one of the central types of cases. Another one is coming from a different angle. And this is the kinds of cases where there might be mixed evidence over whether the subject has the belief in question. Maybe the subject has conflicting dispositions. So this is one case I'll talk about in relation to some arguments that belief isn't vague. So Eric Schwitzgebel gives the case of academic called Juliet, well, hypothetical case, I assume, who will explicitly avow the belief that the races are intellectually equal. And she maybe knows a lot of the literature backing this up. She's firmly states her commitment to that, and yet she is found to exhibit signs of implicit racism. She has a tendency to underestimate black students, as it might be. So she has what seems to be conflicting disposition to assert one thing, maybe dispositions to behave in another way. And Schwitzgebel suggests this might be a case of in-between belief. Maybe it's a borderline case. Now, I think there are clearly a number of different ways you could go on this sort of case, and I'd be interested to talk about them. It's not my area of expertise, but I just put it out there as a putative borderline case, or a source of one. You can adapt the example in any kind of way, kind of vary the dispositions. So if your initial hunch is one way on that, well, you can just adapt it, and at some point suggest you may meet a point of borderline. Another case where you'll have a borderline belief ascription is when the subject is has an attitude to a sentence that itself is a borderline case. So, as I say, I think most language is vague. Tall, classic vague predicate. So you've got clearly tall people. Tech is borderline tall. Do I believe that tech is tall? I think that's a putative case of a borderline belief, but especially supposing he's borderline tall, he's kind of high in the region of the borderline tall. Do I think he's, do I believe he's tall? Maybe the extent to which I believe it matches up with the extent to which it's true, roughly put. So I think it's another putative source of borderline cases. So believes, I think, is paradigmatically vague. It has all the characteristic features of vagueness. Borderline cases, maybe from a number of different sources. A lack of sharp boundaries, as you'd imagine with the varying degrees of confident cases, is most obvious place. You might think of a lack of sharp boundaries. Other cases, when you think of gradually forgetting something over a long period of time. Schwitzgebel has an example where he knew the name of this friend who he was at college with, and then it gets increasingly hard for him to recall it. At the end of the process, 50 years later, he doesn't have a belief that's his surname. Somewhere in the middle, it's a borderline case. Lack of sharp boundaries then through time, with beliefs that you slowly forget, or maybe ones that you slowly acquire. There's a susceptibility to Sorites paradoxes. Imagine just very gradually changing your degree of confidence in something you clearly believe, and then you very gradually lose confidence. Compelling that between 1 second and the next, if you believe it at 1 second, believe it at the next. So you've got that characteristic Sorites paradox. I think there's also higher order vagueness, which is the phenomenon that a predicate not only has borderline cases, but those borderline cases aren't sharply bounded either. So I think you'll get that within belief too. If you went through, say, the gradually decreasing degrees of confidence, you don't suddenly switch from yes, that's a belief to that's a borderline case. So just as tall is a useful expression for us to use, it picks out a vague range of the height scale. To be tall, you've got to be in the upper region, you've got to be above a certain height. What height? Well, vague, fuzzy boundary there. Belief, if you think about the degrees of confidence, you may think that's exactly the same sort of a pattern. But as I say, I think there's putative borderline cases and a messiness through more than just the degrees of confidence. So it might be that belief is more of a multidimensional vague predicate. So with height, you often think, well, whether somebody's tall or not, that just depends on the scale of height. It's really just the one dimension. But whether somebody's bald, it's not just exactly the number of hairs on the head, it might be the arrangement. Whether somebody's a nice person, there's all sorts of different dimensions and factors that build into it. So it's common with vague predicates that you have a messy, multidimensional kind of subvenient base, I say. So the thought is, some people say, vague facts supervene on precise facts. So whether you're tall supervenes on the height. Two people are the same height, either they're tall or both tall or they're not. So we can ponder what's in the subvenient base. What are the determining more specific facts that determine whether or not it's true that somebody has a belief? So degrees of confidence, strength of belief will be in there. Credence, as I'll talk about later, connected, maybe not the same. And your judgment of how probable something is, again, closely related. But then also in the subvenient base, maybe the dispositions to behaviour, more than just betting. Maybe elements about the nature of the evidence you've got for the putative belief. Talk about cases of that later. Maybe elements about how stable your belief is, whether you'd give it up with just small bits of evidence. So there might be all sorts of factors in the subvenient base. So belief's vague, has fuzzy boundaries. As mentioned, and as will be unsurprising, the boundary can vary with context. We're very familiar that if you raise the stakes, something that you'd be happy to endorse in casual conversation, if a lot hangs on it, you may be more cautious, may well be less likely to say you believe it. Other aspects of context, the salience of situations where actually it would come out false. If you're pushed, do you really believe that? I'm very prone to doubt. Do you really think there's going to be coffee? Don't know really. So the fuzzy boundary varies with context, as is common with vague predicates. So it's the kind of vague predicate where you do have a limit case, maybe like bald with 0 hairs rather than like tall, where there isn't sort of a maximum height. But when there is such a limit, there will typically seem to be an option of saying, well, just what it takes to fall into the category is to be at the limit. So there would be advantages to thinking that you only count as believing something if you have degree 1 confidence. So in particular, we'll talk later about failure of logical closure of your beliefs, and won't get that feature if you require degree 1 confidence, but that just doesn't fit how we think and talk about beliefs, where we ascribe beliefs in the lack of total confidence. I think there's very few cases where we would be completely degree 1 confident. Note that the boundary between believing that P, you're not going to, if you imagine the gradual decreasing confidence, you won't typically go from believing P to believing not P. So there might be cases of suspending judgment in between. I think it's useful often to think in terms of not just do you believe, but are you suspending judgment? And that's state, or it's I'm going to talk a little bit about suspending judgment later, but I'm not really clear on what to say about what it amounts to, etc. That will come up later. So I think this is quite an intuitive picture of vague belief. Here's what's happening, roughly some of the things happening later in this talk. I'm going to address some explicit arguments against the claim that belief is vague, particularly from a recent paper by Sophie Archer. Talk a little bit about what seem to be implicit assumptions to the contrary. I think a lot of the time people aren't that interested in whether belief is vague, but may sometimes assume to the contrary, and that may be problematic. I'm going to talk about the bearing of the vagueness on certain debates and issues in the area, for example, the relation between beliefs and credences. Talk a bit about the impact of this vagueness on our reasoning and our understanding of reasoning, and I'll finish by saying a bit about combining the view that belief is vague with a supervaluationist treatment of vagueness, which is my favourite approach to vagueness. So, against vague beliefs. As I say, I'm mainly talking about a recent article by Sophie Archer, but first of all, some what might be a bit straw-manish type objections. But I think you do get hints at this kind of worry in the literature. So the general worry might be, well, look, beliefs, they're important, they're causally effective mental states. Belief ascription isn't just a linguistic classificatory issue, so we should think that if there are beliefs, they've got to be precise, and they've got to be these states. Either you've got the belief or you haven't, and if it's there, it has the causal effect or not. But I think that's misguided. I think a lot of human states that we talk about, a lot of our talk about human mental states and behaviour, etc., involves vague terms. If you think about somebody's hunger, that can be causally effective, I think. Now, of course, it might the causal story in particular token cases may be better explained by talking about the more specific subvenient states, but I think you still have true token causal statements involving beliefs, or involving vague F in general, and vague generalizations over them. So I think that's not a good reason to assume that beliefs can't be vague. I wanted to, relating to that, just interested in this quote from Anna Lightgub's recent book. So he talks. So he's pondering whether to partly about the relation between beliefs and credence in these various states, and whether you might eliminate one of the different categories. And he's against the eliminability of beliefs. So you can't, for example, eliminate those and talk entirely in terms of credences. But in order to defend that, he thinks, well, if we're going to be committed to the being beliefs, you need a unique natural mental phenomenon type, he thinks, entities that carve nature as its joints. Now, does that commit us to a precise category? I think it would be quite natural to think that it does. That whole idea of nature carves, carving nature at its joint sounds like you've got a category like H2O, or got some the gold with its specific atomic number, some kind of precise, scientifically specifiable joint that we pick up on. So if, like Geb thinks that to talk about beliefs, or if we're going to resist eliminating beliefs, then we need this a natural mental phenomenon type that carves nature as its joints. You might think that excludes vagueness. So there's a quote there from a guy given what appears to be one instance of another of successful applications of two belief concepts in everyday life, philosophy and science, could it be that one of them does not manage to pick out any natural phenomena at all? So this is the contrasting thought that it's just we've got to be committed to beliefs because they have this role for us in science, in everyday life, in philosophy. So we should expect that there's a category that carves nature at its joints. So I think there's a slight tension there. It may appear to imply the category of beliefs is precise, but I think if you push down that line, you're going to be tempted to eliminate too many useful categories. So I think in psychology and cognitive sciences, as well as in ordinary language, many of our linguistic categories are vague and still indispensable, whether it's talk of emotions or personality traits or mental disorders. They will often not have precise boundaries, fuzzy boundaries, maybe have an unclear essence. So I think if you hold the... if you think there's got to be the unique natural mental phenomenon, then there may have to be some leeway on what that amounts to. Or I think really that I don't find that a useful way to think about it, or even about the eliminability question. So turning to these arguments in the Sophie Archer paper in Philosophical Studies in 2018. So she talks quite a lot about the Schwitzgebel case that I mentioned early on. This was the case of Juliet, who explicitly committed to anti-racist sentiments, to propositions such as the races are intellectually equal, but yet who has behaviour that seems to pull against that, and Schwitzgebel thought that was a case of in between belief. So Archer talks about this kind of case and comes down on the side of saying that Juliet does believe that races are intellectually equal. She will behave in that way because she'll always assert it. Whatever happens, she'll commit herself to that. And Archer has very much focus on the first person perspective, beliefs as a kind of somebody's beliefs as their view of the world. What matters for belief ascription is the what the subject themselves will ascribe themselves. So I think I don't want to. I don't want to. I'm not in a position to adjudicate over that specifically. I think so. I'm going to focus more on her general arguments that she goes on to argue that against the possibility of vague beliefs, or the thesis VT that there are vague beliefs. And as I say, she's coming from the perspective of a view of beliefs that's determined by the first person perspective. But one thing she says is that the thesis that there are vague beliefs cannot accommodate the necessity of deliberative transparency. Thought that when we're pondering whether we believe that P, that's the same as pondering whether P. That's the transparency of our beliefs. But we recognise our own uncertainty in potential vague cases. I'm wondering whether I believe that there'll be coffee in the break. I may just not be sure. I don't see what it seems perfectly compatible with the transparency, because you have the uncertainty over whether P running alongside the uncertainty over whether we believe that P. She objects that the fact that deliberation is necessarily transparent, she says it's in patent conflict with VT, vague beliefs thesis, that claim that there is no necessary criterion for possessing any given belief. That's a quote from her, which I think is perhaps confused. So in what sense is the thesis that there are vague beliefs committed to the claim that there's no necessary criterion for possessing any given belief? Well, maybe, or necessary sufficient criterion. I think the only sense in which saying there are vague beliefs commits you to saying there's no necessary condition, it would be one that required a necessary condition to be a precise one. So yes, if you think there are vague beliefs, you don't think you can pin down precise conditions for belief because you think there's a fuzzy boundary, but you can still be committed to necessary conditions as long as you've got that matching vagueness. So I think necessary and sufficient conditions can be vague. So, and I think that's so. I don't think the transparency is a problem for the commitment to vague beliefs. Here's another argument she advocates. She says there are three options for concluding your deliberation about whether to believe that P. So you can decide yes, you believe it, you can decide no, you don't believe it, or you can withhold or suspend belief. And she says that commitment to there being vague beliefs would commit you to a fourth option, somehow plumping for vague belief. And she asks what kind of assessment of one's epistemic reasons could justify such a conclusion. So she thinks, well, look, you ask whether P, yeah, so you can say yes, you can say no. If you have the doubts, if you then that's the withholding belief option in the middle. What kind of assessment of your reasons would justify you to plump for vague belief? She says. But I think again this really misunderstands what it is to be committed to vague beliefs. It isn't a separate category of mental state. Rather, we have this complex array of states, and there are some such that it's vague whether it counts as a belief, maybe whether the degree of confidence is high enough, maybe it's simultaneously vague whether you count as withholding beliefs. Now, if you're interested in talking about a subject in that kind of scenario, it may be that for many purposes your best description will be to hedge or to change the question, really. I mean, if you're thinking about Juliet and you're not just interested in belief description, you might be better off talking in more detail about the nature of her states or dispositions. But that's all compatible with there being category of beliefs that has this vague boundary. So when she says, so on this push to kind of, well, either you believe it or you don't, or you withhold belief, she says, well, look, case of withholding beliefs, so they're the ones where you judge your epistemic reasons to be inconclusive, so there's no scope for borderline cases in between. But, well, inconclusive there surely doesn't mean for belief you've got to be have utterly conclusive reasons. That seems to be to have the boundary way too high, as we said earlier. But then in that case, it can be vague, surely, whether one's reasons justify their conclusion. It's vague whether you judge your reasons to be inconclusive. So there is scope for vagueness between the clear cases and clear non-cases. Okay, so I next want to talk a bit about relation between beliefs and credences through the lens of thinking about vagueness. So here's a common distinction regarding the doxastic states. People talk about credences. Sometimes talk about degree of belief, which has a value. So if you talk about somebody's credence in something, you'd say I have a credence of n. And that's contrasted with the other kind of state which might get called all or nothing beliefs, or beliefs implicita, where you don't need to specify a degree, right? So there are some of the terminology. I think it's hard to come up with I don't know what the best term is. I think that contrast between something that the quantifiable credence and a all or nothing category, in the sense that we've got belief or not belief to some degree. So the all or nothing terminology, I think, is tempting, but it can suggest a lack of vagueness. So even when setting out what all or nothing belief is, you get a quote like this. In fact, Hunter goes on to claim that the beliefs are vague, but I think this shows how there can be a pitfall here. So beliefs sometimes take to be an all or nothing affair. Either one believes something or one doesn't on this view of belief. So that's in contrast with it comes in degrees. Core belief, so understood categorical belief. Having a categorical belief is very much like having a penny in one's pocket. The penny's either in your pocket or it isn't. There isn't any in between. Similarly, when a belief is understood categorically, one either has a particular belief or one does not have it. There's no in between. Well, no, I want to say that's not right. That's not the essence of this second category. Just because it's not, with credences you're specifying a degree, with this second category you're not. That doesn't mean that it's all or nothing in the sense of nothing in between, sharp boundary. So no, the contrast with the degree notion is no reason to deny vague beliefs. Indeed, when you think about the lining up of how beliefs might line up with credence, it's very natural to think that there is a vague boundary there. So what is the relation between beliefs and credences? Just say a little bit more about credences first. So I think, and I'll say a little bit more about this later, though I'm running a bit lower on time than I've not planned perfectly. So I talked earlier about degrees of confidence and strength of belief. How do those relate to credences? Better not assume they're the same, as I'll say later. Credences often treated as in an idealized ways, in the sense that, right, so we can have a firm specification, define them in terms of betting odds. So roughly, your credence is determined by what kind of odds you would bet on. Certain qualifications needed about the circumstances for the bet, etc. So see there, it's going to line up closely with your judgment of how probable P is, your credence there will. So much of the discussion and modelling of credence focuses on rational credences, idealisation involved. There are models that try to capture imprecise credences that I haven't got time to talk about here, but that are interesting. I think there's a tension between the natural way of introducing credences via strength of belief, how confident you are, and this sort of idealised picture. So, for example, we're not very good. Most people aren't very good at thinking about probabilities. So our belief in the likelihood of a conjunction might not be related in the right way to beliefs, our confidence in the in conjunct. So we're not going to fit the ideal pattern. So credences are going to come apart from our natural judgment of confidence, perhaps. So I think that's one way in which credences may be part, but only part, of the subvenient base for vague belief ascription. So, relation between beliefs and credences, you might think, well, credence first, we want to understand beliefs in terms of credences. What we should be thinking about is, when we're talking about people, is their credences, and we can just think of beliefs as, say, a region of the credence scale, but focus on credence. Alternative view, think of belief first, their belief simpliciter, their fundamental, maybe there's something messy about credences. A pluralist view, say, Pettigrew defended, where we need both beliefs and credences. They're not reducible to one another. In fact, Pettigrew thinks, there might be other states in there too. And there are other, as I mentioned earlier, like Gab talks in terms of eliminativism versus reduction versus irreducibility. So that's kind of debates you may have when you're thinking about beliefs and credences. I don't think the picture of vague beliefs I'm talking about fits neatly into this classification of positions. So I don't think the credence first option can be a way to go, because, as I say, there's a lot more in the a lot more complexity. The idealisation involved in credence isn't reflected in the beliefs. There's a lot more to the subvenient base, which also seem, and the fact that there are all these complex underlying factors, I think, would undermine the belief. First position as a natural companion to the vague belief thesis, and I think the pluralism claim would seem odd at best. Seems odd to think you're a pluralist because you think there's both tallness and particular heights. So I think I'm going to really just put those debates aside somewhat and turn to what gets known as the Lockean thesis. That's very roughly the thought that, quite a natural thought, that you count as believing something if your credence is above a threshold. So here's Foley, who credited with, the thesis, the term, basing it on Locke, of course. It's epistemically rational for us to believe a proposition, just in case it's epistemically rational for us to have a sufficiently high degree of confidence in it, sufficiently high to make our attitude towards it one of belief. So notice this is a thesis about about rational states. Foley and many others think that the threshold there is context dependent, raised with high stakes, and that it's vague. But the general idea there is got your credences, and the beliefs are the upper range of that scale. Now, one of the famous worries or issues with this kind of thesis is that you get a failure of logical closure of beliefs, in the sense that you can count as believing several premises, but not count as believing the conclusion, even though the conclusion follows, and you know that the conclusion follows. So because each of the premises is above the threshold, but the conclusion isn't. So, nice illustration of this, the preface paradox. So imagine Ali, who's written a big long history book, put a lot of work in, firmly believes each statement in her book, but in the preface she acknowledges that a mistake's going to have crept in somewhere. So she's saying she doesn't believe everything in the book. So it looks that there she's saying she believes all the conjuncts of this big long conjunction, everything in the book, without believing the conjunction that follows from it. So what's going on there? What should we say about that kind of case? That sort of failure of logical closure seems to be a consequence of the Lockean thesis, but also of the vague belief thesis, as I've presented it. I think we should bite the bullet. I think logical closure of our beliefs does fail in this way. I think that the preface type situation is well explained. What's going on in Ali's head is well explained by thinking of her as recognizing that she's not totally confident of everything in every individual statement. She's really, really confident of everything, but she knows that that teeny weeny bit of lack of confidence in each one can add up. When you throw them all together, you're likely to end up with something that surprisingly goes wrong. So I'm willing to bite the bullet there and have a little bit more to say about why it's not problematic. I'm going to skip the Lightgeb quote, he's worried to the contrary. But instead I'm going to talk a little bit about reasoning then. So what's going on in reasoning? That roughly the Lightgeb thought is, well, look, we just reason from things we believe to other things, and are we to say that process is unreliable, that we get led into contradiction? Well, I think what's going on in reasoning is a complex matter. So sometimes we will typically you reason from a bunch of premises to a conclusion, or rather there's an argument, there may be an argument there that you have an attitude to, and there I think can be principles of reasoning governing credence revision, as dictated by a probability calculus. So here's a principle from Hartree Field. The basic idea is just that, as we saw in the premise, little bits of uncertainty can build up, and the level of uncertainty in the conclusion, if the argument is valid, can't be greater than the level of uncertainty in each of the premises. And so you could have a principle for credence that dictates that. So what should you think about the conclusion of a valid argument depends what you think about the premises. You can believe all those premises, but if you recognise there's your credence isn't one, you recognise there's some uncertainty, then you should be mighty cautious. So that kind of principle, I think, is appropriate. People talk about all or nothing beliefs being needed to simplify reasoning. Not sure that's the best way to think about it. As I say, where you can be presented with a logical argument. You need to express caution. Obviously, presented with an argument from some premises you believe to a conclusion. If you reject the conclusion, you've always got the option of rejecting a premise, but also you might alter your confidence in the premises in the light of where they lead you. If the worry is that the threshold kind of view renders this kind of failure of logical closure, the rational failure of belief transmission, too easy and too common. So if the idea is to believe it, you've got to have a belief above the threshold, then it looks like as soon as you've got two beliefs just a bit above the threshold, then you'll get a conclusion that's below it. So maybe the belief, this failure of logical closure will be too common. But in response there, I think it's important to think again about the vagueness. The vagueness of the threshold is crucial here. So I think, as I say, I think it's a natural thought about the preface situation that you recognise there's a lot of premises and that the error can creep in that way, because there's a lot of premises when you've just got two premises, you're going to be less cautious. And just as with a Sorites series has a compelling premise like somebody's tall and somebody 100th inch shorter is also tall, using that premise a couple of times, few steps down the Sorites series may be fine, but doing it a lot of times isn't. And I think we're actually quite good at realising that. Oops, oh no. So I think belief ascription is tolerant to a slight drop in confidence in this kind of way. When we reason, what we should do, I think what we will normally do, is rely only on beliefs that are comfortably over the threshold. Of course, that's a vague notion again. So for example, if you're asked a question and you endorse a belief, and then somebody's kind of launches into kind of drawing conclusions from it, sometimes we can be cautious about reasoning with it. We recognise that this that we need this kind of caution. Sometimes we go wrong, of course, but I think when we recognise the vagueness of the threshold, we can illuminate how reasoning actually works, and when we think about how it should work, then we have to bear that in mind too. So I've mistimed, I'm afraid. So I've got quite a few slides left. What shall I keep going through and try? I'll try and cover them quite quickly. So just briefly here. I think there's lots to be said about Lockean thesis and how you interpret it, what's going on there. As I said, the Foley presentation, it's about rational beliefs. Sometimes it comes across more as a descriptive thesis. Belief just is belief, a credence above a threshold. The Lockean thesis relating belief and credence will look to be challenged by though it's clearly has similarities to my view on vague beliefs. I think that my suggestion that there's a richer supervenience base challenges the sufficiency, so in that having a high enough credence might not be sufficient for belief, because there might be other elements of your doxastic stakes are important, as some cases I'm going to briefly talk about in a second. On the other hand, a case against necessity of having a high credence is necessary for a belief ascription. Well, that might be undermined by the kinds of cases where your dispositions to behave, say implicit bias cases, where you might not bet on the things that that your other behaviour indicates you believe. So I think it's messier. Belief is much messier than would be captured by certain versions of the Lockean thesis. So I did want to talk, and can talk more in the discussion, about some very interesting cases from Lara Buchak. So I'll just do these quite quickly. So these are cases where she argues that credence, high credence, doesn't amount to same as belief, and shouldn't rationally, when your credence is high because of what she calls merely statistical evidence. So here's a case, the iPhone theft case. She's in a room with Jake and Barbara. She goes out. She comes back in, and her iPhone's been stolen. Who does she believe has stolen it, Jake or Barbara? Now, suppose she knows that men are 10 times more likely to steal. Arguably, that justifies a high belief in the probability that it was Jake. Thus, that's a similarly high credence in that. But as she said, your belief, if she were to claim she believed that Jake stole it, that would seem problematic or wrong, says Buchak. That it wouldn't, a belief there wouldn't be justified, even if the high credence is, because it's based on the merely statistical evidence. She said, tying in with the thought belief isn't rightly, isn't justified. So, well, it would be wrong to blame him, and belief is tied in with and that's because the belief isn't justified. And so if you're inclined to think that, well, that's because the credence that was justified in that case wasn't high enough. Well, then she says, well, but you can imagine a parallel thing where there's somebody else who's been looking through the window and is really pretty confident that it was Jake who stole it. But we can't, but she's not, that witness isn't 100% reliable. We can assume that she's less reliable. Suppose she's 75% reliable. Buchak said that could still justify the belief that it was Jake that stole it. So even though the credence there might be 0.75, whereas the credence justified by the statistical information is higher than that. So there seems to be tension, a reason to, she says, to worry about credence, the grounds for credence and belief being different. So it's messy, and I'm sorry I've run out of time. I want to talk about reference classes, etc., in relation to this, but instead I want to say that I think my view on her case is that those cases is that she's too quick on the side of the what credence is justified. Now, this might line up with what exactly credence is. If we thought it was, does it show that she's justified that when her phone's been stolen, she's justifying in a high degree of confidence that Jake stole it? I think not. So, if forced to judge probabilities, she might think, and tentatively, that the probability is quite high, but I don't think that should be that's not coupled with a rational high degree of confidence to the extent that she claims. So in that kind of case, with the merely statistical evidence, you might think it's appropriate to suspend judgment on who stole the iPhone, but also but I think regarding the kind of degree theoretic stuff, the quantitative kind of degree of confidence, I think we need a kind of notion of suspending judgment there. I think in a court of law, if you're assuming somebody's innocent until proved guilty, or you're suspending judgment on their guilt, you're not bringing in the statistical evidence about from reference class they fall into. Well, nor should you let that determine, well, I've got this high degree of confidence, or I've got this high credence. I think you should be suspending judgment in that respect too. I think the upshot for the vague belief thesis, though, is that it emphasises how the subvenient base, the more specific states on which the beliefs supervene, is richer than just the credence as kind of betting odds. Maybe the nature of the evidence is a factor there. So just to finish with, I wanted to say a little bit about my view of vagueness, supervaluationism, and in relation to vague beliefs. So supervaluationism is a view of vagueness whereby a vague predication is true if it's true on all admissible specifications of the term. So we think about, is somebody tall? Are they tall on all ways you'd make tall precise? And borderline cases then are tall on some, not tall on others. So similarly then we can think of beliefs as being able to be made precise in different ways. The specifications don't need specifiable boundaries, so if it were all a matter of credences, then we could, clearly the different specifications would be different numbers in the scale, but since we've got a messier base, we don't need to be able to specify them, but we can understand the workings of the vague language by quantifying over all these different specifications. We can accommodate context dependence. What counts as a way of making belief precise can vary with the context. And so I think we can accommodate the various cases in this way. So, for example, the Juliet case, we may say, well, on some ways of making belief precise, the third personal factors are required, in others they're not. On the one advantage of supervaluationism is that it preserves classical logic. When you say either he's tall or he's not, even when he's borderline tall, well, either he's tall or he's not is true however you make tall precise, even though sometimes it comes out true he's tall, sometimes not. So we get to preserve the law of excluded middle. Similarly, then, either S believes that P or they don't is always true. And that may help diagnose why that all or nothing belief, that tendency to think, well, yeah, either he believes it or he doesn't. Yes, but that's perfectly compatible with the being borderline cases. So classical logic holds for vague language. So in particular for statements about beliefs, how does that fit with the logical closure case? Well, that's because it's in the embedded context, so it's true that Ali, the author, believes all the things, but not true that she believes each of them, not true that she believes all. I think we can accommodate other aspects of thinking about vague beliefs. So Foley, who, as I say, talks about the Lockean, introduces the Lockean thesis, acknowledges that the threshold may be vague, but is doesn't seem that bothered by it, and has this, I think, slightly odd quote: perhaps we can just stipulate a threshold. We deal with other kinds of vagueness by stipulation. Why not the same here? I find that slightly odd. I'm not sure in what sense we deal with other kinds of vagueness by stipulation. I think I don't think that's the right way to. We don't typically go around stipulating sharp boundaries. We deal with vagueness despite not stipulating, and same then for beliefs, I think. But maybe what he's indicating there is that we don't need to really worry about the boundary. It's vague. We don't need to worry. And I think that kind of attitude could be rationalised by supervaluationism. There's all this stuff that's true, however we make belief precise, and a lot of the thinking we do can focus on that. So, very briefly, in conclusion, got a messy, complex array of doxastic states. It's useful to nonetheless talk in terms of beliefs, albeit a vague category. Thinking about vague belief may illuminate reasoning, etc., and thinking about the borderline region gets us to all sorts of interesting cases. There are roles for both idealization in studying beliefs, credence, etc., but also reflecting on the messy reality, and that's some of what I've been pondering here. So I don't think the vagueness of belief should just be put aside. So that's where I shall leave it.
Do you think that the sort of considerations you have been putting forward here about vagueness and belief apply equally to any account of belief? So this is what I have in mind. So let's say roughly there are like two different accounts, the representationalist and the dispositionalist. Mm-hmm. And Sweetgebel's account that really takes clearly a dispositionalist account. And on that account, vagueness sort of comes naturally, because dispositions are running and dispositionalism in general is sort of like, in that sense, already messy. Yeah? Oh, okay. So should I, did you hear me?
I did hear.
Okay. So I can see that is going to work rather smoothly if you are, and if you endorse a dispositionalist account of belief, but I'm not so sure that it will work so well if you choose the representationalist account of belief, where a belief is a representation in the belief box, if you want, old-fashioned, but still, I think, quite plausible representationalist account. Because if you think about the philosophers out there who still endorse a representationalist account of belief, in order to explain the sort of phenomena for which you invoke vagueness, they need to do something else. I'm thinking here, I don't know, Eric Mandelbaum invokes fragmentationalism, because the kind of problems with acquisition of belief are solved by invoking how many tokens of the same belief are activated in different fragments of the mind. And if that's the way to go, then that might be something to think about, since fragmentationalism doesn't seem to be uncontroversial, let's put it that way. So my question is, do you think that the sort of considerations that you have been talking about apply equally to different accounts of belief, or is there a particular account of belief for which vagueness in the way you describe it actually is more plausible?
Thanks, that's really helpful. So I think I want to say it applies for any. So I agree that in the disposition list there is a particularly natural way to think of how the vagueness arises. But I think there, on a representationalist account, the representation in the belief box kind of model, aren't the borderline cases. I think that, again, like the talk of all or nothing belief suggests, it's in or it's out. But I don't think when you think about problem cases, even just like different degrees of confidence is in. So you might kind of count up tokens or whatever, but it won't there be. I don't think that. So I don't know the literature, I'm afraid. But I don't think there would be a plausible characterization that would draw a sharp boundary, or rather, because I think we do have these in-betweeny cases, and so belief can be representational, but it's still, there are cases where it's not clear whether or not the belief is in the belief box, and I think your model needs to be able to allow for that, and the ways in which it's useful to be talk in those terms. We maybe need to be able to think about how you could have cases that are still borderline. So I need to look at the literature to make that good, but that's the way I'd want to push. But thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Rosanna. So I wanted to ask about kind of vague predicate that you think belief is. You say that it's multidimensional. And then it seems that the dimensions are degree of confidence, then conflicted dispositions, and whether the predicate one believes about is itself vague or not. And I was not convinced that it's multidimensional. That it seems to me that it's only the vagueness of belief is caused only by degree of confidence. That's sole dimension. So if you think about whether the predicate is vague or not, you can have a belief that is not vague at all, even though, thinking, I believe that John is tall, maybe John is vaguely tall, that my belief can be perfectly non-vague. That the question of whether I believe that John is tall or not doesn't arise. So it's not. So what I try to say is that the vagueness of the predicate may introduce some question about whether you believe or not, which is in the end the thing about whether what kind of degree of confidence you have on that. So I would say that the last case reduces to degree of confidence, and then about the second case with the conflicted dispositions, that it's presented as a third personal description, and that's different. But then when you move that kind of case to first personal description, then if you have conflicting dispositions and you recognize that you have conflicting dispositions or mixed evidence, then that lowers the credence or the confidence in your belief. So it's a case where you would say well, I'm not sure whether I believe this or not, because I'm always saying this, but then I see that I'm not behaving accordingly. So if you're interested in first personal descriptions, because they are the ones involved in reasoning and so on, then it seems that the vagueness of belief comes down to degrees of confidence. That was my impression.
Thanks. That's really interesting. Really helpful. Okay, so I think in saying that it's multidimensional, I'm more concerned to deny that there's a single kind of well-ordered dimension that a single scale that we can have the boundary over. So maybe you've got heights, and supposing everyone has an exact height, that's just this clear-cut single dimension. And so I'm contrasting it with that. So to be multidimensional, it might be that there are several clear-cut dimensions which all factor into whether the predicate applies. And it's not clear that none of the others are as clear-cut as the degree of confidence. Though actually, I don't think the degree of confidence dimension is that clear-cut either. So on that last point, I think degree of confidence is messy too, and different factors feed into it. So that might kind of though that doesn't sound like it's leading you to multi-dimensionality. It's just a different sort of vagueness. I think it might be that you could think you could model degrees of confidence in different ways and think of those as different dimensions, so they're less further apart. Our belief in vague, the tech is tall kind of case. I'm not totally sure whether thinking of that in terms of degree of confidence is the right way to go, but maybe it is, in which case that wouldn't be a separate dimension. I agree. But then other factors in the multidimensionality or the messiness of the subvenient base, things like the Budget cases I touched on at the end, where maybe the nature of evidence and the subject's attitude to the nature of evidence can factor in there without it factoring in cleanly in relation to degree of confidence. In short, then, I think, in my main beef with saying it's multidimensional is saying it's messier. It's not your straightforward case, and I think we should look beyond just thinking about degrees of confidence, or it might be partly that it's a matter of honing in on what the degrees of confidence amount to and whether they're as unidimensional as they seem.
Dan?
Thank you very much. So I am also very sympathetic, as you know, to supervaluationists. So false is not an objection, it's just to be clear that I was understanding the shape of the response to the first part. So as you were saying at the end, all the characterization of all nothing beliefs that you provided by Kunter, all of the sentences turn out to be super true, that they're merely true according to supervaluationists, even in the presence of borderline cases. So with respect to the coffee, it is either the case that you believe that there will be coffee or that you don't. So if I was following it right, your response to you were not complaining against the transparency constraint, but you were claiming that it might be vague whether the condition holds. Now, combining the two bits, so the shape of the situation seems to be as follows. With respect to the coffee, it's determinedly the case that you know that there will be coffee or that there won't, but it's indeterminate which of the two poles. Is that?
Yes, yeah. So the commitment to belief being vague is that there are borderline cases, but as you say, being a supervaluationist, I think that you still have these truths about either this, I believe this coffee or I don't. So how does that help in relation to the Archer? Maybe that would have been if I talked about the Archer after the supervaluationism, that would have been a way to explain the transparency thing. She's saying there's a problem with transparency, combining transparency with vagueness, or and with supervaluationism in mind, we can see that you can preserve these general transparency statements, etc., without there being a sharp boundary. So what she's saying is no objection to the suggestion that beliefs are vague. Does that make sense? So I think I'm agreeing with you there. Is that?
Yeah, I was.
Just getting clear on. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Okay. You can.
Thanks. I'd like to ask you something about closure. So one lesson of the preface paradox, lottery paradox, is that closure or conjunction agglomeration fails, and that seems to be in line with, you had on your last slide, I think, that with supervaluation you're going to lose closure, right? But there's another diagnosis of those cases which says that we are operating with too naive a conception of what rationality or justification is. And I'm taking those cases to show something about epistemic operators, not just whether belief is closed, but whether rational belief is closed, because that's the way in which those paradoxes are used normally, right? So Martin Smith has argued against this idea, right, that S is justified to believe that P only if P is made probable, highly probable, on the basis of S's evidence. And by rejecting this view and arguing for a different one, he gets to preserve closure, conjunction agglomerations. Sven Rosenkrantz has, in a Mind paper, qualified versions of conjunction agglomeration principle and so on and so forth. So so I'm not sure whether that's, so it's a good result that closure fails with a supervaluationist account, because that might be incompatible with certain, like, more sophisticated views of what rationality or justification, epistemic justification is. So I would I'd like to ask you whether you're going to preserve the compatibility, or whether for you that's a reason to reject those views on justification or not, because that would be also another option.
Okay, thanks. I don't think supervaluationism would rule out those types of view. So I think it's neutral to those. So I think the way in which the closure fails on the supervaluationism isn't it's dependent on your view of belief. So if you've got so I'm just saying that if on the earlier grounds where I was happy to accept the failure of logical closure, so I think it is the case that she believes each, but not believes the conjunction. And if those are right, we can kind of explain that in supervaluationist terms. But if Mud Smith's right, as it might be, then the belief ascriptions will fall out differently, and you won't get the failure of logical closure, I think. So I think it's independent, actually. I'd have to think a bit more and look in more detail So I don't think supervaluationism commits you to rejecting those kinds of views. But thanks, that's very helpful.
Right, thank you. This is just a request for clarification, basically here. So you said you accepted that someone can determinately suspend judgment about P, right? That doesn't mess with the upholding the law of excluded middle, right? Because that would be a case in which you don't, so not believing that P counts as, so suspended judgment counts as not believing that P, is that the idea?
Yes, I guess it would. Yeah, that's right. So the boundary might be between believing and suspending judgment, and then that would count as not believing. Thanks.
Okay. Javier?
Thanks for the talk, very interesting. So my question is about the relation between credence and full belief or outright belief, and your reasons for preferring a Lockean or threshold view if you want to argue for the idea that belief is vague. So I'm not convinced that you could not go for any of the other options, for example, belief first positions. So if I remember correctly, one of your reasons for not choosing belief first views is that there seems to be a conflict between vague belief, belief first views, and the idea that vague categories supervene on precise fact. But I mean, as I understand belief first views, they only claim that belief is prior to credence, but they don't claim that belief is primitive or basic in a sense that they don't supervene on anything else. You could still say that belief supervenes on dispositions, for example, and actually I think that many belief first theories think something like that belief can be characterized in terms of disposition, reasoning dispositions to act, and then you could have the sort of a story you were sketching at the beginning of the talk, that you can have conflicting dispositions, or maybe dispositions themselves are vague and supervene on something else. And in this way, of course, the Lockean view also fits naturally with a vague story about belief, but you could remain neutral, and then you don't have to argue against all these objections against the Lockean view, which is quite controversial. So.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Yeah, you're right, I was too quick on that. You're right, I just, in that context, I had a simplistic view on how I was thinking belief first, but that's clearly not right. I guess the defences there were kind of hypothetical options in a sense, but you're right that often the motivation for belief first will be, here are all the problems with credence, and let's get rid of credence. But as you say, clearly those people aren't going to need to be committed to belief as this sort of self-standing state. They can still accept the subvenient base. So that's quite right. What follows? I guess my claim was that the vague belief thesis doesn't map easily onto this debate, but I'm not sure much hangs on that. I just need to be more careful with how I think about that option in particular. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have just a quick follow-up on the logical closure argument. So I was wondering what the conclusion was supposed to be in the end. So you had two different separate beliefs. I believe I'm in the biggest room in the building, A, and I believe the coffee is my belief, B. So I believe them separately. But on what you presented, I won't believe the conjunction. I won't believe that I'm in the biggest room and there'll be coffee. Let me just finish with one more sentence.
Oh, sorry.
I think there are many different reasons why you might think logical closure fails for beliefs. You presented a very particular case. And then I was wondering if you think that can be the case, that I have two separate beliefs. I believe conjuncts, but I don't believe the conjunction. Is the conclusion and the bullet conclusion, as you put it, that this is psychologically possible or that it is rationally defensible?
So I think I wasn't defending the thought that you could have those. Oh, I'm not going to be able to find it. Those straightforward failure in the case of two conjuncts, but don't believe the conjunction. I think if there were sharp thresholds, then you'd evidently be able to have that kind of case. So the fact that the threshold is vague, I think, means that such cases, it's not clear whether they're ruled out, but they're certainly not going to be, how do you put it, psychologically real, in the sense that you're not going to be able to present a clear case. Look, I believe these two conjuncts, but I don't believe the conjunction, because the vagueness will interfere. I think there is failure of logical closure, which gets exhibited when you've got longer arguments or whatever. And when it comes to thinking about our beliefs, the vagueness of we'll endorse the beliefs that we think are firmly above the threshold. You're not going to come across cases where there's a clear case of that failure of conjunction elimination. That's my introduction. That's my hypothesis about a role for the vagueness of the threshold.
And very quickly, where exactly do you bite the bullet there? What's the conclusion?
In, say, a preface case, when you've got lots of conjuncts, the whole conjunction. I do believe each of the conjuncts, but I don't believe the conjunction. It logically follows from it. Okay, but if you say, how about just take these two? Oh, well, no, that's not a clear case where I believe the premises but not the conclusion. Add them up, and it's going to be vague at which point you say, when you get to 4, does it? It's going to be vague at which point you've got your counterexample. But there are counterexamples, because have enough conjuncts and you get the failure of the logical closure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any more questions? No, yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. When I have time, it's a very simple-minded question. I was wondering how the model would carry over to other attitudes. And I was thinking, for instance, desire. There's also cases in which you can have different degrees of confidence in your desires and conflicted desires. And, you can desire, and you have desires with contents that seem to be vague. So I was wondering.
Yeah, I think it would I agree that a similar model would be appropriate there, really. So I think that desire would be vague in many similar ways. And as you say, though, you don't talk about the strengths of desire. In a similar way, you've got the natural thought. There's a kind of scale, and to say desire is a kind of vague range of above a certain threshold. So I think there'd be a lot of similarities there too. Yes. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, if now we are on time, so let's thank our speaker, and